So we asked you guys what you wanted to see more of on our channel, and you told us that you wanted to see the performance of more APUs. But before we actually start purchasing some new ones, or at least until they turn up, because we have ordered a couple, we thought we'd revisit one of AMD's best. Now this is the Ryzen 5 5600G. We have done videos of it in the past just to see what kind of performance you could get when playing some of the older titles. But in today's video, we're going to be taking a look at it against our standard suite of test games, which are much more modern titles, ones that you generally wouldn't pair with something like this. See how well it performs when it comes to those more modern games, and also see what we need to do to actually get them to become playable. While doing this though, we'll also be able to create a baseline to measure other APUs going forward. So that's what we're going to be doing today. Now, as we have taken a look at the Ryzen 5 5600G in the past, it was about 6 months ago, it's probably time for a revisit anyway. We're going to jump straight into it. Now, the processor itself is a 6-core 12-thread processor, and it's got a built-in Radeon Vega 7 graphics. Now, that's not the strongest in terms of graphics. Obviously, it's just an APU. It's not anywhere near what you would get from a discrete GPU, but as a processor, it's actually pretty decent. So for anybody trying to build a super budget gaming PC, this is something that you can actually start with and then upgrade your graphics card later. Now, for those of you that watch the channel often, you will know what our standard test suite is. It has adapted over time, but we now have a suite of about 7 games. Most of them are pretty modern, and they range across different engines and all that kind of stuff. So hopefully it will give us a good indication of how well this CPU performs when it's actually pushed to its limits. Not only that, it will actually give us a chance to actually see what people that are using them are getting, and with a bit of tweaking, what they could potentially do to get games in a little bit more playable state. Now, running it against our standard suite, we didn't get that very good results. Looking across all of the games, we could not get anywhere near what we generally call our target of 1080p high settings. They didn't perform as bad as I thought they were going to do, most of them getting into the 20s in terms of average frames per second, but there were a few of them that got nowhere near. The best game in the stack was Spider-Man Remastered. Now, that game looked fantastic, but clearly at 27 frames per second with a 1% low 16, it wasn't a very good experience. The worst games of the lot though were obviously Cyberpunk 2077, which when running in 1080p high gave you an absolute awful gaming experience. You just couldn't play that game at all, it was just too stuttery. And of course God of War, which got an average of 13 with a pretty decent 1% low considering the average of 12. Now, that game again was just as bad as Cyberpunk 2077 when it came to the experience of gameplay. It was very stuttery and there was no way that you could actually play that game. Shadow of the Tomb Raider was a little bit of a surprise to us because it only got 16 frames per second. Now, it is a reasonably modern title, particularly when it comes to the Tomb Raider games, but it generally does perform pretty well compared to the others when we're testing discrete graphics cards and things like that. So that was a little bit of a surprise, but obviously the built-in Radeon Vega 7 graphics just couldn't cope with that kind of game. Now, when it came to those benchmarks, the CPU side of this APU had no issues at all. And if you paired it with a pretty decent graphics card, even something like an RX 6600 XT, it would actually perform exceptionally well. But the built-in graphics are just not enough to be able to squeeze that kind of performance out. So what did we need to do to actually get these games playable? To find out, we needed to replay them all again, and we needed to tweak settings up and down until we found what we felt was the best settings that you could use. First up, we had Back 4 Blood, and this game must have been one of the easiest games to get a playable experience from. Dropping the quality settings to low preset and decreasing the resolution to 720p, we managed to get an average FPS of 57 with a 1% low of 32. Not the greatest in terms of performance, but a playable experience, even if the graphics were quite sacrificed. As expected, Cyberpunk 2077 was one of the worst performers when it came to our target settings of 1080p high, but with a bit of tweaking, things started to smoothen out. Dropping the quality settings again to low and decreasing the resolution while enabling FSR 2.1 with a balanced setting, we managed to smoothen the game out quite a bit. With these settings, we managed to get an average of 33 frames per second with 1% lows of 21. You probably wouldn't want to play the game with this performance, and neither would I recommend it, but you could if you wanted to. Now, Doom Eternal surprised us a little when it came to the target testing because it usually runs quite well on anything, but we only managed to get an average FPS of just 30. But with a little bit of tweaking, we did manage to get something quite playable. Simply dropping the quality preset to medium and decreasing the resolution to 720p, we managed to get it more than playable performance of 54 frames per second on average, with a 1% low of 40. Now, this doesn't sound amazing, but due to the game, it was more than playable, and with the quality settings being at medium, it looked good too. God of War is simply a game I would not recommend playing though. though. In our target testing, it was completely unplayable, and no matter what we changed, it just didn't seem to get any better. Lowering all of the settings we could, including the quality preset to low and the resolution to 720p, while enabling FSR 2.1 with the performance setting, the Ryzen 5 5600G still could only pull around 21 frames per second. Not a great gaming experience, so this is one you will just have to avoid. Red Dead Redemption 2 was the oldest game within our test suite, but we do like to include it because not only is it still quite demanding, but it is a great example of how well optimized resource-hungry games can get. Unfortunately, this hunger for resources though really does suck the life out of the Ryzen 5 5600G, and no matter what you changed, you are not going to see great performance. In our target testing, we saw an average of only 20 frames per second, with that only rising to 43 when lowering everything. Pulling the quality preset slider to the bottom and dropping the resolution to 720p and enabling FSR 2.0 with a balanced setting, the game was playable, but like all the others, at great sacrifice to the game's quality. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is not the newest game here, and it also isn't the oldest, but it does have a name for itself when it comes to good optimization. Unfortunately, within the target testing, this didn't really come through, with the Ryzen 5 5600G only managing to get an average of 16 frames per second. With this performance, the game was unplayable, but with a few tweaks, we did manage to get it to the point where you could play it, if you really wanted to. Dropping the quality settings to a low preset and decreasing the resolution, we managed to get an average of 38 frames per second, with a 1% low of 30. Not amazing, but for a single player adventure game, you could get away with it. The last game in our testing was of course Spider-Man Remastered. And in our target testing, it wasn't actually that terrible. Even though we only managed to see an average of 27 frames per second, the game was reasonably playable, but to really increase this, we had to make some big sacrifices to the game's quality. Dropping the quality preset to low, decreasing the resolution again to 720p, and enabling FSR 2.1 with the performance setting, we managed to pull that average FPS up to 43. The 1% lows weren't terrible, now at 28 frames per second, but the game looked terrible, and it just isn't something that you would want to ruin. Now, as you can tell from those results, you're not going to get a fantastic experience from this APU in any of those modern titles. You can get some of those games quite playable, but we are talking about a couple of generations ago kind of console experience, running into the 30s, maybe kind of the 50s on some of those games when it comes to average FPS, and some of them had pretty decent 1% lows, but there were a couple of titles there that I just wouldn't recommend you play at all. We do know though that this APU is actually pretty decent when it comes to the older titles. We have tested that before, so make sure you check the channel out to go and have a look at how it performs when it comes to some of the more older titles, things like Tomb Raider from 2013 and things like that. It's actually a great experience on those games, but of course you're not building a gaming PC in 2023 just to play Tomb Raider. So what else can you actually use this kind of APU for? And the answer to that is of course esports titles. We did do a little bit of testing around some of the esports titles, in particular CSGO. Now CSGO is actually a pretty easy title to run. It's not as easy as the older versions of the game, but you can actually get a pretty decent experience. We tested this APU in CSGO and we got pretty decent results. Running in a 1080p resolution with a quality setting of set to high, you could actually get around 100 frames per second. That's not perfect for competitive play, but if you are a casual gamer that likes to just have a bit of a go of things like CSGO now and again, it'll obviously serve your needs, especially if you're waiting to get a graphics card. Now, of course, the answer to our question of is an APU good enough to be an entry-level gaming PC is probably at the moment no. These APUs are good, let's not forget that, but they're not as good enough to actually play modern titles in a decent kind of resolution and setting to give you a decent experience. But we have created a baseline for ourselves, so when we're going to be picking up some more APUs just like this one, maybe a little bit older, we're going to have something to measure it against, and then we're going to start documenting our findings so that you guys can see. Make sure you drop a comment below to tell us what APUs you want us to test next. What do you want us to actually pick up? Obviously, AMD probably hold the crown when it comes to built-in graphics on their CPUs. I do want to pick up one of their 7000 series CPUs because the iGPUs in them are supposed to actually be pretty good. I've took a look at some of the benchmarks out there and they actually beat these 5000s in most games, so that's going to be quite interesting. But of course, I want to know what you think. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you like this kind of content and if you want to see our journey going through some APU testing going forward, and we'll catch you in the next one.